Here's the key verse of Hebrews chapter 11. It says, without faith, verse 6, it is impossible to please God. For he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. You say, well, Pastor, that's different than the exact words you put on screen. I memorized that verse in the KJV, and I will never get it out of my head, okay? But ESV, KJV, it says the same thing. We're going to return to that verse again and again and again in this series over the next several weeks, because in it, you see the threefold conviction of biblical faith. Again, God is real. Number two, he will keep his promises. And number three, seeking him is worth the effort. Over the next 11 or so weeks, we are going to turn this thing called faith around like a many-sided diamond, with each character in Hebrews 11 showing us a different side of that diamond. Now, verses 4 and 5, he is going to give us his first two examples of faith, the first two sides of our faith diamond. Verse 4 is our first one. By faith, he says, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Basically, what he was saying to them was this: you don't have to try and cover yourselves. You can't cover your nakedness. You couldn't do it if you tried. Trust me, and I'll do that for you. I will cover your sin and shame. Well, see, Abel believed that promise, and he gave his offering in response to it. Through his offering, Abel was basically saying, this offering is not an attempt to cover my sin or to earn your favor. God, you have already promised that to me in your deliverer. This sacrifice is just a way that I can say I believe that promise and that I belong to you. Cain, by contrast, hoped that through his offering, he could earn God's favor. Through his offering, he was saying, God, look at me. Look at all that I've accomplished. I am good enough to earn your favor. This grain offering is expensive enough that it should buy your goodwill. Do you see the difference? The main point is not that Abel offered a lamb and Cain offered grain. The point is the heart behind their offerings. One was given as an act of faith in gratitude for having received God's favor. The other was given as an attempt to earn it. You're always wondering, though, is it enough? See, the thing about being Cain is that you always wonder if you've done enough to earn God's favor. Is this enough, God? Is this enough? Are you okay with me now? And that makes you resentful of people like Abel, who seem to have the assurance of God's favor. That's some of you this morning. You gotten religious, but you still have the heart of Cain. That's the bad news. Please don't murder someone on the way out, by the way. The good news is that you can be Abel right now. Just believe what Abel believed. That's all that it takes, that God has sent a deliverer to take away your sin just like he promised he would. And that he fully accepts you now because of what that deliverer has done. God did not accept Abel's offering because he'd lived a better life than Cain lived. That's kind of the whole point. He accepted Abel's offering because Abel believed that God would do what God had said he would do. And he made his offering trusting in that promise. Listen, just in case you're not connecting the dots here, God has provided the deliverer that he promised in Genesis 3:15. His name is Jesus. He paid for your sin and covered it over through his death, just like God promised Adam and Eve he would do one day. That deliverer who would cover our sin debt and crush the head of the serpent has come. All you have to do is believe it and then make your offerings in response to God's favor and not as an attempt to earn it. Cain makes his offering to earn the approval of God. Abel makes his offering because he's assured that he already has it. He's received it as a gift. Which leads me to the second thing about Abel's offering that demonstrated faith that was distinct from Cain's. Number two, Abel gave his offering trusting in God's provision. Abel's faith extended beyond just a belief that God would cover his sin debt. He also believed God would provide for his future. So let's briefly consider Enoch, our second example. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken up that he should not see death, and when he was not found, because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Full disclosure here, we aren't told a lot about Enoch in the Bible. His story comes right after Cain and Abel's in Genesis 5. It takes up a grand total of 7 verses in our Old Testament. And 5.5 of those 7 verses, by the way, are about how long he lived and who his relatives were. That means all that he did in his life, all that he did is encapsulated in just 1.5 verses. Genesis 5:22 is the first half verse. Enoch walked with God. Verse 24, Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. That's it. That's 16 words total, and 4 of those words are repeated, which means 12 unique words about Enoch's life. And yet that is enough to get him into the great hall of faith. What side of the diamond of faith does Enoch show us? Well, again, Enoch represents a life of faith that, look at Enoch's 2 things. Number 1, is set apart from the world around it. Number 2, testifies boldly to the gospel. And number 3, makes walking with God its defining reality. Regardless of your profession or your age or anything else about you, those 3 phrases should describe your life. Do they? Can you say you are actually a person of faith? That you believe the gospel and not fervently be trying to tell others about it. Finally, is walking with God the defining reality of your life? Or is God something you schedule in for a few hours on a Sunday? For Enoch, you don't get the impression that walking with God was one item on a to-do list, something that dominated 2 hours on a Sunday morning. No, walking with God was not one item on a to-do list. Walking with God was the list on which every other item went on. God's kingdom was not one of his priorities. God's kingdom was the framework through which he filtered every other priority. Listen, in the true life of faith, everything from your job to your relationship to your hobbies, all of it is about pursuing God's kingdom, glorifying him, and walking with him. That's why the Apostle Paul says, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatsoever you do, do all to the glory of God. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever would come to God must believe that he exists, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Faith's 3-fold conviction. God is real. He will keep his promises. Seeking him is ultimately worth the effort. The life of faith, a life of total abandonment to God and complete trust in his promises, whether you see the fulfillment right in front of you or not.